you doing, everybody? I'm Ken Bykoff, and welcome to O'Neill Speaks, the official podcast of the Paul H. O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. As climate change continues to wreak havoc across the globe, how best to combat the issue remains a topic of hot debate. In the United States, the vision of a green energy future is entangled with complex realities. Aging infrastructure strains under modern demands, the adoption of new technologies remains uneven and fragmented, and many households struggle to secure reliable, affordable energy. Too often, Americans are left out of the decisions that determine how power is produced and distributed, leaving energy in America a matter of race, class, and wealth. We're joined today by Lynton K. Caldwell Professor David Konisky, who is co-author, along with former O'Neill School faculty member Sanya Carley, of the new book Power Lines: The Human Costs of American Energy in Transition. David's research and teaching focuses on U.S. environmental policy and politics, with emphasis on environmental and energy justice, regulation, federalism, and public attitudes. Konisky is a founding co-director of the Energy Justice Lab, a research collaboration between Indiana University and the University of Pennsylvania to explore, measure, and improve the equity and justice dimensions of society's ongoing energy transition. David, thanks so much for joining us.
You're welcome, Ken. Great to be with you.
Walk me through how this book came to be.
Yeah, so we've been working on this topic for quite some time. So my collaboration with Sanya Carley dates back over a decade. And we began thinking about these issues as we kind of imagine what the policy world might look like as we try to sort of hasten the transition to the clean energy transition. There's so many changes that need to occur to address the urgency of climate change. And when you begin to think about the layers of these policies and how the changes that are required to make new technologies available, to change the generation of our energy system towards renewable sources and away from fossil fuels, the implications are really dramatic across the country. And what we began to think about more systematically is who are those individuals, who are those communities that may find themselves left behind by this transition.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Some of those layers that you mentioned, what are those layers?
Yeah, so if you think about, a whole bunch of different policies or activities that try to bring about a renewable energy future or a future where we're relying on more energy efficient technologies, these cost more. They require a bunch of new infrastructure, and those costs are not going to be evenly distributed across society, right? So there's lots of different ways we might think about this. Think about the energy you consume in your home and how, as we sort of transform, modernize our energy system, that may result in higher prices. Some people can absorb those higher prices quite easily, but for many others who are living already on the margins, facing higher energy bills is really challenging. Another example might be where this new energy infrastructure is going to be placed, right? So we have a system of power generation which goes back many decades, generations. Think about big, large power plants. But as we move towards more renewable, efficient technologies, that's going to require different communities to host this infrastructure, places where it's sunny, places where the wind is blowing. And that's asking a lot of places that may not be accustomed to these kinds of technologies in their backyards. So that's another kind of cost associated with the energy transition.
What are some of the biggest challenges facing the United States in terms of energy transition?
Yeah, I think the thing to think about the most is the scale that needs to happen in terms of the transition, right? If we are serious in the United States or elsewhere across the world on taking on the challenge of climate change, what's required in terms of that transformation, that transition, is really massive. Everything from power generation, right, how we generate electricity, how we transmit that electricity over long distances requires new transmission lines and distribution systems, probably going to require us to invest heavily in batteries and battery infrastructure. So we really need to transform the power generation sector of our economy. We need to find ways to electrify everybody's homes, right? Many of us have had homes traditionally that have relied upon natural gas for heating, for example. We need to decarbonize that sector of the economy as well and have people move away from natural gas furnaces, for example, to electric heat pumps, perhaps put rooftop solar on the roofs. We think about how we get from place to place. We need to transition from gas-powered cars to electric vehicles. Of course, we then need the electricity to meet that new demand. So you can sort of see how this begins to cascade. So I think the biggest challenge with the energy transition is scaling it. Where that comes in for us in our book is thinking about who is going to more easily be able to adapt to these changes, right? And historically in our country, new technologies cost more. They're not as accessible to everyone. So those who are more well off, have the means to do so, will more easily be able to kind of adapt their lifestyles and afford the higher energy bills, for example. For others, this will be a much bigger struggle. Not just people who are lower income, but people who might live in energy inefficient housing, right? Or people who may be in communities that have historically been reliant on the fuel sources or the energy sources that we're moving away from. Where do they go for their next job? Right? What does this mean for their community in terms of lost economic vitality and tax revenue and the rest? So the scale of the changes and the distribution of the costs and benefits of these changes is really at the heart of our book, and I think is what really is the challenge that we face with the clean energy transition in the United States.
When you talk about the human element of it, especially, I thought it was interesting about I know you mentioned coal in West Virginia and in places like that. The challenge of trying to convince people to make these changes when the technology that's being used is maybe what is it might be best to phase that out over time. How much of a challenge is that to have people make these already difficult changes in their lives that also could then impact their livelihood?
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. One of the pieces of the research that we talk about in the book is that we spend some time speaking with coal miners or coal miners who are transitioning to new labor opportunities in coal mining communities. And I think the economic implications of the transition are quite intuitive to most people, right? And there are many examples throughout U.S. history where one economic sector is on the decline and people have to transition into new sectors. So that part of the story is not necessarily new. What really struck us in speaking with people in coal communities is that there's a real feeling of loss and of sacrifice and of being left out of the transition. Coal miners and others in coal communities repeatedly told us that they felt that they had been used and forgotten, right? That they had invested their livelihoods, their communities had really invested in coal and sort of extraction as the base of their economies. And as the country decided that we needed to address climate change and move away from coal as an energy resource, or sometimes this is just because of market forces. The United States sort of rediscovered fracking and natural gas became so plentiful. This had a similar negative impact on coal communities. And people feel quite frustrated that they are sort of losing out on their identity, right? Coal is part of the cultural and social fabric of these communities. It's how they sort of define themselves. And as the country and the world perhaps turns its back on coal as a resource, again, necessary because of the challenge of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, they don't know where they fit into that future, right? Doesn't mean they need to pick up and leave and go find a job elsewhere. What does that mean for family structures and connections to communities? And the people we spoke to in coal communities are really attached to the places where they have grown up and to their communities. And there's a feeling of potential loss that comes with that, which was really stark in our conversations.
I'm a big history guy, and you've had this kind of thing happen before, whether it is moving away from canals to ship things to rail, or moving from horses to cars, moving from rail to highways. These different things have happened time and time and time again, and yet people do eventually find a way to adjust, but it is difficult for people to accept. What advice did you learn, or what may have surprised you in talking to people about making that transition and what their next steps might be?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So I mentioned we talked to the folks in coal communities. We also talked with people who are in sort of the auto assembly communities,
Sure.
particularly in the industrial heartland, like here in Indiana, people who have had generations of their family working in auto plants, who are thinking about similar issues as we transition from gas-powered cars to electric vehicles. And one of the things we heard repeatedly is not just that frustration and sense of loss that I was describing earlier, but a real desire to be part of what comes next. Right? It wasn't a hopelessness. It wasn't a belief that there was no path forward.
Right.
There's just a concern that they were going to be left behind, that they're going to be left out and not be included in the sort of the new technologies that are necessary with the energy transition. So I think what was really interesting about those conversations is that people were recognizing that the transition was occurring. They weren't trying to fight it necessarily, but they really felt a strong, desire to be part of what comes next. That's challenging, of course, because the geography of our economy is very uneven, right? So it's not, so coal is located in particular places. The jobs of the future may not be in those same places, whether they relate to energy or not. And similar, in the auto industry, where traditionally in the United States, a lot of that has been based in the Midwest, it has been kind of moving to the Southeast over time. And oftentimes then people are kind of forced with this reality of they may having to leave their communities, right? So it's this complex mix of emotions that people feel. And what was kind of a common current through a lot of our research in this space was that people do feel a real sense of place attachment, like the connection to where they are. And part of what's happening with the shifts in our economy and in energy markets is those attachments are being disrupted. People are feeling not only are they might losing some of their identity and their connection to their community, but there's a realization that in order to find the next opportunity, they might have to go someplace else.
The evolution of the topics that you cover in this book. Obviously, you kind of before any I've written books, any kind of you put together an outline of what do we want to talk about. What was kind of the evolution of what you decided on what you wanted to talk about and the different topics in Power Lines?
Yeah, so it's a great question. We spent a lot of time thinking about how to piece together a book that connected different elements of our research over the past decade. And one of the things about our research agenda is that it is increasingly mixed methods. We're spending more time talking with people and a little bit less time just running statistical analyses and regressions. And one of the things we decided with this book is that we wanted to tell stories. Right? Tell stories of individuals, tell stories of communities. So as we began to sort of think about what might make for a compelling book, what topics we wanted to cover, we wanted to be sure that we had sufficient material and expertise to share regarding these stories, to sort of tell a narrative about what's happening with the clean energy transition and to really emphasize the human dimensions of it. Right? Because while the energy transition is about technology, it is about markets, and it is about public policy, in the end, it's about people and how people are, how they interact with energy in their homes or perhaps in where they work and what their jobs might look like. And we wanted to really tell stories as a way to kind of link the different topics that we included in the book. So our book has really covers a large portfolio of our research, that some that has taken us, to West Virginia and to the auto communities I was mentioning before. But we spent a lot of our time thinking about the affordability of energy in people's homes. We've spoken to many people who, for example, have lost access to energy in their house because they are unable to pay a bill. Yeah. We have spent time surveying Americans about how they feel about new energy infrastructure coming into their communities. So we had a lot of different sort of topics in our research that we thought we could weave together into a common story that was sort of thematic and that was really illustrated through stories.
Do you find yourself encouraged about where we are with an energy transition and just kind of everything that goes into it? Technology is always going to move forward. And obviously you have entrenched technologies that are going to fight along the way. Are you encouraged about how the development is going in kind of that curve towards moving towards cleaner energy?
Yeah, I think At one level, yes. I think, and we write in the conclusion of the book, that the clean energy transition is inevitable, right? Like we are going to have a different energy economy. What's unclear is how quickly.
Right.
Right. So there are so many advantages to the newer, renewable, more energy efficient technologies, and technology is becoming better, more sophisticated, more accessible every year, right? Not just the United States, but across the world. The challenge, of course, is making sure that transition happens fast enough given the climate crisis and given the urgency that we see around climate change. And that's the rub, and that's the real challenge, is how do we, from a policy standpoint, move us toward cleaner sources of energy faster so that we kind of meet the moment when it comes to climate change. And then importantly for the book, how do we do so in a way that kind of brings everybody along the best we can? So I'm optimistic that the transition will happen. I couldn't predict at what point we kind of, we can say that it has happened as a past tense kind of a thing. My concern, though, is that when we have these interruptions in policy, like we're seeing with the current Trump administration, it slows us down, right? It's disruptive, and it means that it'll take us longer to sort of get to the end. So that gives me concern because we don't have that much time to spare given what the science tells us around climate change.
What are some of the promising technologies that you feel really could take the next steps forward that are close enough to being scalable?
Yeah, there are many. There are many technologies that we have already access to, right? I think this is an issue around the energy transition where there is no sort of dearth of technologies already available. The question is if they are accessible, right? Those aren't necessarily the same thing. Whether it's electric vehicles, whether it is rooftop solar or more energy efficient HVAC systems for people's homes, we have the technologies to decarbonize many sectors of our economy, and we've made great progress already in many parts of our system. The challenge, there are a couple challenges. One is making sure that those technologies are affordable and that they are accessible to everybody. And the reality is that something like an electric vehicle is still quite expensive. And as we've made recent policy changes, they become more expensive because we've done away with some of the tax credits that the federal government had put in place. And then when it comes to things like residential energy technologies like rooftop solar or heat pumps, not everybody is able to either afford the upfront costs. Again, they can be quite expensive, even with the tax credits when they existed. But not everybody controls their roof. If you're a renter, right, you don't have the ability to put an array of solar panels on your roof, or to change out your HVAC system to make it more energy efficient, or to be run on electricity, for example. So there are challenges even with the existing technologies, making sure that they are sufficiently diffused across the population, and that's necessary for taking on the climate problem. There are some sectors of our economy which are going to be much more difficult to decarbonize. Some heavy industry, for example, we still have a long way to go in terms of finding those technologies. But there's a lot we can do already today with the technologies that are at scale. And the challenge is sort of driving that cost curve down so that more people can have access to them.
How do we drive that cost curve down?
Yeah, so historically, sometimes this happens over time, naturally, with technological innovations. You think of something like cell phones. When cell phones first came out, they were a luxury good that not everybody could afford, and now they are ubiquitous, right? So part of this will come through time, but policy can make a big difference here, right? And that's what's a little bit frustrating, or a lot frustrating, to be candid, about recent changes in public policy is that with, for example, tax credits that were included in the Inflation Reduction Act, they were really targeted at making these technologies more affordable. Not necessarily affordable, but more affordable, kind of moving in the right direction. So there are certain things you can do in the tax code as a way to create incentives, otherwise sort of subsidize the adoption of these technologies. That's been kind of the tried and true approach that we've pursued in this country. In time, we'll probably revisit those as policies as a way to move forward. In the meantime, finding ways to be sure that people can afford the energy in their homes. There are lots of different programs out there that we could adjust let's say, the cost of electricity to make them more affordable to lower income households. When we're talking about workers who might be displaced from legacy energy communities, whether it's coal, or thinking about folks in the auto industry, we can sort of redouble our efforts at job retraining to help people kind of reskill to find career paths that will be more viable, more consistent with the energy transition. So there's lots of things we can do, and public policy has tried these things at times. What's been really challenging over the past couple decades is that public policy kind of flip-flops with every presidential administration, and we haven't had really a lot of continuity in policy. So I think what's really required is to have, a set of time where we have continuous policy that can really, again, drive the cost curve down, create more job opportunities, more economic development chances for communities, and in the long term, that will pay off.
Where could people find Power Lines?
Power Lines is available wherever you like to find your books, whether it's your favorite independent bookstore or Amazon. It's available everywhere, and we're really excited to have the book published and hope people find it compelling.
Well, congratulations on the publication of the book. Again, it's called Power Lines, The Human Costs of American Energy in Transition. We appreciate your insight, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ken. Great to be with you.
Well, that's all the time we have today on O'Neill Speaks. O'Neill Speaks is the official podcast of the Paul H. O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs. All opinions and comments on O'Neill Speaks belong to the host and guest of the O'Neill School and don't necessarily reflect those of the school itself. Music for O'Neill Speaks is by Manos Mars. Be sure to subscribe to O'Neill Speaks on Apple Podcasts or on your favorite podcatcher app so you don't miss an episode. We're out of time, but for now, and for the O'Neill School, I'm Ken Bykoff saying thanks for listening, everybody.